Oriol, another tricky but often asked question. Is there a way to use Azure AD, now called EntraID, for workloads running on AKS Hybrid and with Azure services, or to authenticate against Azure services and Azure resources?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we get that that a lot. So the question would be like, how can I, through my workloads, consume Azure services by leveraging Azure AD authentication, which is a recommended way to connect to most of those services, and in many cases, the only way to do that. So how can I authenticate to those services in order to access its functionality? So we have several options there. So far, probably the most common one would be to leverage Azure AD service principal credentials. So we would go to an Azure AD tenant, create a service principal. We would get a token, a client ID, and a token or a secret that then we need to manage. And then we could use the SDK of our choice to authenticate and connect to Azure AD using those service principal credentials. Okay, that's one way to do it. It's been the only way for quite some time, but the issue with it is that then we need to think about how do we manage those credentials. We need to store them somewhere safe. Some people would have used Kubernetes secrets for that, or store them in a vault on premises. I don't know, but those management of credentials is something that is probably not ideal. Luckily for us, we have a new feature that was released recently, which is called Azure AD workload identities for Kubernetes clusters. Okay, this uses a combination of features that we have had since Kubernetes version 1.23 and recently released in Azure AD, which have the federation workload identities in Azure AD. So with Azure Kubernetes, what we can do now is we can get a token for a service account that is being signed by Kubernetes, and Kubernetes exposes a well-known OpenID endpoint that can be used then to validate that issued tokens by Kubernetes were in fact issued by that Kubernetes instance. Okay, so we can expose that well-known ID endpoint publicly, which can then be later used to validate those tokens. We can use this in combination with the new federation identity feature in Azure AD or EntraID, which allows us to link an application in Azure AD with external identity providers. Okay, we can do that, for instance, to federate with GitHub or with other external entity providers. And basically, we're telling Azure AD that whoever comes with a token issued by that entity, that exchange that by an Azure AD token for that particular service account. Okay, so by using a combination of those two, we can enable workload identities. And let me share this with you for a second. This is a feature that can be enabled for any Kubernetes cluster, not just AKS Hybrid. By doing that, it will deploy an admission webhook within our cluster. And basically, every time that a pod starts, it will use the default credentials of that pod, which in case you're not aware of, every time that we start a pod, unless we explicitly disable that, it will be loaded. It will have a local token for the default account associated with the namespace of the pod where that is located. Then the admission webhook will try to exchange that token in Asia for a service account token. And if that is configured by using the issuer being our current Kubernetes cluster and a common name that is presented, which should be the current pod name, if that then is configured as a federated entity in Azure AD, it will be exchanged by an Azure AD token. The Azure AD workload identity library will manage all of this under the hood for us. And what we are going to get is a local file with an Azure AD token every time that pod is started that we can then directly use to connect to Azure services on behalf of that pod. So it's really cool scenario. We no longer need to manage passwords or secrets anywhere. We can just configure federation in Azure AD, and we can automatically get identities for the pods that are running, for our applications that are running in our Kubernetes cluster. So this is super cool. And I suggest that you replace the kind of old service principle-based approaches for connecting to Azure by this new technology based on workload identities.
Sounds easy. So
yeah.
At least for someone like you. So as you know, I'm a dumb infrastructure guy. No, perfect. That answers our question for today. Again, to everyone out there, if there's more, just use the comments and give us more
Absolutely.
to talk about.